Hi, welcome. This is Janelle in Rarity with the Eco Spiritual Education Center, and I am speaking with you today about a really central topic for essentially every single person on the planet and every single other than human being on the planet as well to a degree, and that is climate change, grief and anxiety, or climate grief and anxiety. And whoa, so big. I I've received a lot of interest about this talk beforehand, and normally I make a ton of notes before I come on my full moon broadcasts and speak to you guys. Every full moon, I do a live stream on something that's just alive, something that's interesting to me, something that I've been getting a lot of questions about, something that my clients have been bringing up. And this month, this is really front and center. And so normally I make a lot of notes beforehand. And this time I felt really strongly that this needs to be a flow. This needs to be really alive, really in the moment. And that's how I like to work best anyway. So if you're able to be here live today, then send me your questions in the chat. And if you're watching later on a recording, feel free to post a question anyway, and I'll cycle back around and answer that question when I see it. So just take a deep breath, release, because when we're talking about climate anxiety and climate grief, it's so much bigger than any one person, than any one family, than any one community, than any one nation, right? It's something that is both on a global scale and also something that is on a very large time scale. We have had a stable climate for a relatively stable climate for long enough for humans, who are a very small part of the evolutionary scale, but for long enough for us to really build something globally. And we are faced with this moment where that might shift to the point that it might not be livable for humans. It most likely won't be livable in the way that we have been living, which is the crux of the matter. And it's affecting millions, if not billions, of other species who might not be experiencing what we describe as climate anxiety, but they're experiencing displacement, death, and extinction. So this is a very serious topic, and hopefully also will bring some lightness and some levity in the sense of connecting to something bigger, connecting to something deeper, something more eternal, and coming from a place of action and not a place of panic. So when we're talking about climate anxiety, there's a lot of emphasis on like panic, it's an emergency, and it is an emergency. And panic rarely does anyone any good, right? So how do we work with this anxiety, which is sort of a low-level panic, right? And then if it increases, we have what we call a panic attack, right? It's literally this overwhelm of the nervous system where you're not acting rationally, you're not acting functionally for making a real change, taking a solid action. So how do we work with this very important, legitimate, significant anxiety and make it into something that is actually helpful for our own internal process and for the process in the world? At the Eco Spiritual Education Center, the sort of slogan that I work with is personal healing with global impact. And this is at the heart of that work, doing personal healing, your personal work, your inner work, hey Rob, and taking that out into the world in a way that makes a real difference and that is in relationship. So one of the place that I want to start is talking about climate refugees, actually, because this is something that is becoming more and more relatable for more and more people, both seeing other people experiencing it and experiencing it ourselves. So to some degree, everyone is becoming aware that we are in this closed global system, right? And when something happens in one place, the results go somewhere else. We're not living in isolated communities any longer. So from a personal example, for example, about 15 or so years ago, I was living in Florida, and there was a series of hurricanes that came through, and it was one after the other. 4 weeks, there were 4 massive hurricanes, and one of them was called Ivan the Terrible. So people from Florida or people near Florida will remember this, and it also went through the Caribbean, and I believe part of the northern part of South America as well. Double check that, but it was this enormous storm, and I was alone in my room at this during this storm. I had a place that I could go, but at the time I was alone in my room during this storm, and I was watching in the ceiling, right? There's this huge wind moving around, and in the ceiling there's this bubble of paint that started to form, and over the course of hours it got bigger and bigger and bigger till it was this big bubble, and then they started popping up all over the room. So these huge bubbles of paint forming in the ceiling of my room, and then these little pinholes started to form in the base of some of these, and they were dripping water. So I was going around the room placing buckets under these giant paint bubbles, and knowing that that they could burst at any moment, they could flood the space, that if the storm continued to get worse, I would be in this small room, and that is very anxiety inducing. And I had to do some inner work, be calm with it, know what I was able to do and what I wasn't able to do, what I could surrender with, and where I could take action. And I was fortunately in an area where the storm did not have severe impact. It had impact, obviously, you can see from that story, but it didn't have severe impact. But a few weeks later, I drove north to North Florida and stayed with some family friends who were severely impacted, who had to evacuate, who were waking up in the middle of the night, remembering the sound of the storm that had woken them up in the middle of the night, who had trees fall on their houses, who had sores breaking out over their body because they had been exposed to some contaminated water, who had lost their homes, who had lost family heirlooms that they had in fireproof safes but that weren't waterproof. Like, so much happening, and these things were on the news, but not to the degree that they were actually happening on the ground. And it was years before I could even talk about being there without tearing up, without crying, because the impact was so severe. And that's one incident, right? So all over the world, these types of events are happening with increased frequency and increased severity, and people are having to move to new places. People are having to leave behind, in some cases, everything that they've had. And so that is just on the human scale, right? And we're looking right now at what's happening in Australia with the fires. There are jungles in Australia, forests in Australia that are burning, that haven't burned since the time of the dinosaurs. And the degree of impact there is something that we really can't even imagine, right? We really can't even fathom it. I don't know if you've seen the image of the Australia fires from space, but these fires are across this entire continent, and it seems, if you live somewhere that's not Australia, like Australia is smaller or remote, or it's hard to imagine the impact when you see the overlay. The size of it is like the size of the United States or the size of much of Western Europe, and you get the image, the relationship there of how much land is burning and how many animals are impacted, how many plants are impacted, and how many people are impacted and having to leave their homes. And one of the real tragedies there is also that the Aboriginal people in Australia, the Indigenous people of Australia, had been managing these fire patterns for millennia. They know how to manage these fire patterns, and colonists all over the world have moved into places where fire patterns were being managed by the Indigenous people there, and intentional burns were occurring at the right time of year in the right amount. And that hasn't happened in at least 100 years, in some cases 200 or 300 years. And that's why we're seeing, partly why we're seeing these massive fires that have impact that we don't know about. So you know a lot of these things, but I want to bring in that framework now to get in touch for myself, speaking with you now, to get in touch with the level of impact and the level of grief and the scale that we're talking about with climate grief and anxiety. So when I have clients come in for counseling or for coaching, sometimes they'll bring in something that they're perceiving as their own personal grief, their own personal process. And as they start to work on it, as we start to explore the nature of that grief, the nature of that process, oftentimes what emerges is this sense of global grief, of global anxiety, of helplessness, of a sort of end of the road feeling that says, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to move forward. I feel like the world is going to end, and I'm taking it on into my own life. So how do we take that very real grief and anxiety that is so much bigger than the individual and both process it on the individual level because the individual is experiencing it, and take it out into the world and say, yes, there are these things happening that are worthy of grief and that are anxiety inducing, and yet we are here. We are still here. We can still take action. There are extraordinary people who are visibly taking action right now, and there are many, many people who are taking action who we don't see on the everyday level, whether that's because they are not getting press, whether that's because they are just quietly doing their work and not seeking press, whether that's because they're just doing their work and they don't even know that the scale at which they're working is so impactful. They're just doing what they do. Right? So you might be one of those people in one of those categories. And what I want to invite today is the thought that everyone can be one of those people in one of those categories. So let's start with the anxiety piece. Anxiety, if you've ever experienced anxiety, and sometimes we have anxiety experiences. I know I've had anxiety experiences that I didn't identify as anxiety until later, but it can show up in a lot of different ways. Anxiety can feel like paralyzing. Anxiety can feel like really fast-paced and sort of multi-directional, like your attention is going in lots of different directions and you can't quite land on any one thing. Anxiety can feel rushed. It can feel like things are impossible. It can feel on the physical level, like your heart is racing, like there's tension in your shoulders or in your hands, your arms. It can feel sometimes like you want more stimulation, like you want to have a lot of fast-paced stimulation, like you want a cup of coffee. It's like you want to kind of feed that. And at a really high level, anxiety can feel like what I referenced before, an attack, right? I've had a couple of anxiety attacks over the course of my life. And the first time I had one, I thought I was having a heart attack. And I was like 23 years old. And I thought, this is impossible. I was a full-time yoga instructor. I was a vegan. I was like supposedly the epitome of health. And I felt like I was having a heart attack. And what got me through was remembering that someone had told me that they'd had a similar experience. And so That's the extreme level of anxiety, right? And some people have that experience on a fairly regular basis. What I want to invite when that comes, whether consciously or not, in relationship to this big global picture, hey Manfred, that experience is a very reasonable experience considering what is happening in the world. It is a in some ways a rational response. It's a physiological response. There is a real danger, and don't let it stop there. So when we're talking about the process, right? I'm a process worker. I'm always thinking about the process, not just the isolated experience, but the process. When you have that anxiety, that fast-paced, tight, overstimulated experience, don't check out of it. Don't just let it overwhelm you. Go into it. It seems counterintuitive, but see if you can allow yourself to go into that space and even intentionally amplify it a little bit. So I know for myself, the first thing I experience in anxiety is this kind of, I keep going like this, right? It's this chest tightness and this sort of, my breath gets shorter, right? So there's a lot of advice that says slow your breath, take some deep breaths. And that's really handy, especially if you need to shift things very quickly. And that doesn't tell you about the nature of the experience itself. So the nature of the experience itself is this tightness and shortness of breath, right? So if I go into that, if I amplify that a little bit and I go, and I ask myself as I'm doing that, what's happening? So I go in and I just say, what's happening? What's happening right now? And I make it even more. I say, oh, there's a frozenness. There's something that's so intense and I'm not acting. So it's so tight and I can't act against it yet. So I say, okay, it's really tight. I'm going to go in. I'm going to feel that tension. I'm going to make it even more tight. I'm going to make it even more compressed. And when I really feel that compression, an interesting thing happens. A big breath appears. I don't make myself take a big breath. A big breath emerges from that tension naturally, and it's relieving, but I didn't override the tension. I went into the tension, and the breath emerged from the tension. And from that space, from that, and I notice that I feel suddenly free to look up and look around. And this has been my consistent experience working with this climate-based anxiety in particular, is this, the anxious impulse is go in, freeze, don't connect. When I go really deep into the strength of it, and I allow that natural breath to emerge. It's going to be different for everyone. For me, that's what happens. The natural breath emerges and I look up and look around. And I realize that the connection is the key thing. It's my ability to look around and say hello to this plant that is alive right here in the moment, to say hello to these incredible resources that I have in my life, and to be able to make those connections from that place of actually very intense power. There is so much power in the compression that is creating that anxiety, the pressure that is creating the anxiety. When I can pick that up and allow it to be real for me in the moment, and to create a breath that allows me to make this connection, I recognize that that is the most fundamental thing we can do at this point, is to connect, right? If there are people all over the world who are And that's going to be all of us. If you are currently in a place where you have not had to do that yet, all of us are going to have to respond in some way. Many of us are going to have to move. All of us are going to have to live differently. So whether that's been you for a long time, or whether you're in a place of transition, or whether you don't quite yet see it, it seems like something on the news, any way, shape, or form, connection is the key. Being able to reach out and say, how can I connect? How can I be in relationship, in reciprocal relationship? Not just how can I help? How can I be helped? How can I create? How can I create resiliency? Resiliency has to do with connections from lots of different directions, constantly in play. A great example of that is in my undergraduate work, I did a massive oral history project on a system of community gardens. And in that system of community gardens, one of the garden members had given a plant to another garden member, like a bunch of that plant. And so they each had some of this plant. I don't remember, it might have been lemongrass, but so one gardener gave part of their crop to the other gardener planted it. And then the first gardener, the one who gave, their original plant died, right? And then the one they had given it to was able to give some back because theirs had continued to grow. So that's the type of resiliency that I'm talking about with all aspects of our lives. This is the direction that we need to move. This is the direction that we've come from, that humans evolved with, emerged with, and that many people in the world have continued to live with. Despite industrialization, despite colonization, many people have continued this reciprocal relationship, this resilient relationship, in terms of everything from food to shelter to individual relationships. That's the direction we're going to have to return to. Social media I find really fascinating in that way, because it's like a flirt of that experience. It says, we want that again. We do this online, and yet online there's a disconnect because people feel a bit anonymous. People feel free to bully one another. People feel free to say something and run away. And in a real, fully reciprocal relationship, that's not going to work. But the social media is a fun kind of emerging flirt with this innate human experience. And that is a key piece in working with climate anxiety, is doing that with the people who are in your immediate sphere. So all of that has been addressing the anxious part of climate anxiety, but what about the grief? The grief, I'm going to say, so I'm speaking from the United States, and this culture in particular, the mainstream US culture is so grief averse, is so averse to letting go, to death, to accepting death. Right? It causes a lot of death, but to going into what that actually means is so taboo. It's so underground. And so when we are talking about this large-scale ecological impact, when we are talking about the deaths of entire species, when we are talking about people losing their homes, when we are talking about forests that haven't burned since the time of the dinosaurs, the depth of the grief there is, to me, beyond any one person's capacity. It's something that is so far from an individual's capacity. And interestingly, I think that grief is always, to some degree, beyond an individual capacity. So my individual background is Judaism, and in Judaism, there is this fundamental idea that you don't grieve alone, right? So in order to say, there's a particular prayer that is said to honor someone's passing, You have to have 10 people to say that prayer. It's required to be in community, and that speaks to the idea that grief is not for an individual alone. Many cultures around the world that I'm not as familiar with as the one that I was raised in have something to that effect that says, don't grieve by yourself. We are here. We hold you in this space, or we grieve together. I know that in Irish tradition, there is, I don't remember the name of the individual, but someone comes in and cries for everyone to bring that grief to the forefront. That's their job. They come in and they have big tears, big waves of grief to bring that to the forefront. So all around the world, humans have these types of practices that say we don't grieve alone. And in particular, in this collective experience of climate change, it's, I would argue, impossible to grieve alone. And yet we must each feel our own feeling, our own experience. And so there's a balance that must be struck that says, if you are just grieving alone, it's too much. It's too much. So how do we feel the grief and allow it to be real enough that we can process it, move it through, and then move into action? To me, is the real question. So let's start with the feeling it and moving it through. Talked about community. If you have community spaces, whether they are spiritual spaces, dance spaces, religious spaces, writing groups, support groups, whatever kind of space you have where you can go and be yourself and express, go there and talk about your experience, or feel your experience, or move your experience through your body. It doesn't have to be a group that's focused on climate, right? It can be a group that's focused on anything that matters to you, that holds space. So go into that space in community. And then also when you're by yourself, allow the grief to come through in ways that express and then transition. So sometimes I will read something in the news and I will just fall to the floor crying, and I allow myself that space. Just cry, just express, just let it come through my body, get out of my head. Don't think about what to do. Don't push it away. Sometimes I have to push it away. I want to say sometimes that also is what you have to do to get through your day. So both are necessary. But when you're struck by the feeling, allow the feeling to come through. Go to the ground. If you can go outside and you can put your body on the earth, or at least your feet or your hands on the earth, go there, cry there, grieve there, allow yourself to connect to the physical earth and let the feeling come through. And once the feeling has moved through, know that in the current state of affairs, in some ways, it's a bottomless pit, right? In some ways, there's so much. As I said a minute ago, you can't just hold it by yourself. So allow it to come through as much as it needs to come through for you, for that day, that moment, and then come back, restore yourself however you need to, do something to clear that space, and think about some sort of small action you can take. So I want to encourage the idea of small actions in working with climate grief and anxiety, because it's so enormous. So when we see this huge issue and we see this need to take big action, it can feel overwhelming and anxiety inducing to think, I'm one person, I'm living my life, I'm going to my job, I don't have a massive political platform. What can I do? How can I possibly do anything? There's nothing I can do. And so I want to encourage this idea of small action, to say, if everyone is taking small action, we are taking big action. And small action can be calling somebody and saying, hey, I see you, we're in this together. That's part of the resiliency. Small action can be, if you live in an apartment with a tiny balcony and you can put a plant on your balcony in a pot that is a native local plant for pollinators, and you can provide this one plant with food for bees and maybe a little bowl of water for the bees, you are helping the whole environment. If every single person who had a small apartment with a small balcony or a window box for planter planted local native pollinator plants, I don't even know the numbers there, like how many opportunities that creates for our pollinators, which is, bees are a keystone species. I'm actually preparing an event this March about bees, about working with bees. So that's very much on my mind. If everyone took that small action, that's a big action. If you have more space, you can plant a garden, you can start to grow your own food, you can harvest rainwater, you can, if you have skills, you can teach small classes, go to your regular job, teach a small class about the thing you know how to do. But take these small actions and let those be one step at a time. It seems paradoxical because it's an urgent moment, but if everyone takes these small actions and allows themselves to feel their feelings, to feel their grief, to move into the anxiety and find the power behind it, then we are collectively making a change. So I want to invite you now to go into a little bit of a dreaming exercise with me. And this is an invitation to go into kind of a liminal space, into a dreaming space that is not linear, that is not mind-based, but that is allowing something to come through in a non-local way. So as long as you're not listening and driving here, if you're in a safe spot where you can allow your eyes to close, I would encourage that. If you don't feel comfortable closing your eyes, that's completely fine too. Just take a moment to allow your body to become a little relaxed. I'm wiggling my shoulders a little bit, moving my head a little bit, even a little twist to my spine here. And take a breath and exhale. Just drop in. If your feet are on the floor, feel your feet planted on the floor and imagine your feet going all the way down through the floor into the earth. Imagine that you have some roots in your feet. If you're in a place where you can lie down, you might lie down and allow your whole body to sink in and even become a little bit heavy. Notice your breath. Notice the sensations in your body at this moment. And as you feel, just recognize you are here and the moment is now. It's the only moment we have is right now. And feeling that presence in your body and in your breath. Allow yourself to dream a little bit about the earth, about this home that we all share. And imagine a place on the earth, a climate or a bioregion or a specific garden where you feel the most at home, where you feel relaxed, where you feel nourished. Some place that really speaks to you on a deep level. It might surprise you. Some place that speaks to you on a deep level, maybe where you have been, or maybe where you have never been. someplace that emerges in your imagination, someplace on this earth that speaks to your experience right now, that allows you to feel connected. Notice that place on the earth. Notice what qualities it has. Whether it's a wet or a dry climate, whether it's a vast place or whether it's small, whether it's an edge between two climates, such as a beach or a meadow meeting a forest, or whether it's a densely and completely one type of climate or one type of area. Notice what the temperature is in the air. Notice the sounds. Notice the sounds made by the creatures, the animals, the wind, the rain, whatever is present in this place. Notice the sounds present. And notice the smells. What can you smell in this environment? Allow all of your senses to be present. And as you notice everything you can about this place on the earth, imagine, if you will, for a moment that you are this place. You're not a visitor. You are this place. Allow yourself to become this place for a moment. Allow yourself to be this type of environment, this specific place. Allow your body to dissolve into the beingness of this place on the earth. Notice what it's like to be this place. What sorts of energies, what sorts of powers, what sorts of tendencies do you have when you are this place? And as this place, give your everyday self some advice. You're going through so much change, humans. What does this place have to say for you personally? What would this place like you to be aware of? What would this place like you to know? And is there something that this place would like for you to do? And allow whatever comes to come. It might come in an image, or a song, or a memory. It might come in words. There are many ways that this information might show up, and just allow it to show up in its own way. Allow this place on the earth to communicate with you in its way. Being this place, see what wisdom there is for you, whether in feeling or in action. And you can stay there as long as you like. And when you're ready to emerge from this dream space, come back into your own experience of your body. I like to offer thanks to the energy of that place, to the essence of that place. Thank you for allowing me to be in relationship with you. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. And I recommend taking a moment to just jot down a couple of notes so that you remember that dream space. Sometimes when we go into these liminal dream spaces, just like with nighttime dreams, the memory of it can get a little hazy. So make a couple of notes and take that into your action and your daily living around working with climate change, working with climate grief and climate anxiety, remembering that we are connected, that we are part of this whole Earth experience, and that anytime we want, as human beings who emerged from this planet where we still live, we can tap into this planet's wisdom and use the information from the Earth herself, itself, themself, to move us forward in a way that is in alignment with the deeper dreaming of the Earth. We are not separate. The grief, natural response to pain and destruction and change, but the anxiety is a disconnect. The anxiety says, I don't know what to do, and I believe that I'm separate. So grab the power of that anxiety, move through into the grief, and then deeper into the connection. And from that place of connection, take your small actions. Those small actions will become big actions, whether or not you see it, whether or not the world's eyes are on you. That's not the point. Take those small actions, let them become the big actions that they are in the world when we collectively act. And that is the process of shifting into really a return to dreaming with the Earth. So I welcome questions. If you're watching the recording later, feel free to put questions in the chat or send me questions. Sign up for my newsletter, ecospiritualeducation.com. You'll get regular updates about events like this, about one-on-one offerings, about group courses where we go much more deeply into this work. Today's offering is a free offering, so please share it widely, and that's the reciprocal relationship that we were talking about there. Please receive this, share it widely so that other people may benefit from it, and so that I may continue to share this type of work with people. Thank you for showing up today. It's been great to see the group coming in today, and I hope this has been beneficial to you, and I wish you beautiful and deep dreams.